Hello, dear friend. We're delighted to have you on the Historical Facts channel.
Cyclops, the eye of myth, the bone of legend. A history of the one-eyed giants, from ancient skulls to eternal story. Prologue, a single eye in the dark. Imagine standing at the mouth of a cave on a Greek island 3,000 years ago. The sun is setting behind you, painting limestone cliffs amber and blood orange. You are an ancient Greek sailor, and you are lost. You entered this cave because you were hungry. Your captain is brilliant, dangerously so. A man whose mind works like a blade, quick and double-edged. But tonight, even he hesitates. The cave is enormous, impossibly so. The ceiling vanishes into shadow above, and the walls are hung with damp and age. Great wheels of cheese sit along one wall, each one taller than a man. Pens of sheep and goats crowd the back of the cave, unnaturally calm, as if accustomed to something you are not. And the bones everywhere, picked clean and white, stacked in loose piles like discarded pottery. Not sheep bones, not goat bones, human bones. Then, from outside, comes the sound of footsteps. Not footsteps as you know them. These are impacts. Each one shakes the ground. The shadow that falls across the cave entrance blots out the last red light of the evening sun entirely. And then you see it, the single eye, enormous, milky pale at its edges, dark and terrible at its center, staring into the cave as if it already knows you are there. This is how it begins. This is where the Cyclops lives. Not only in the cave on the fictional island of the ancient storytellers, but in the imagination of every human being who has ever stared into darkness and felt something staring back. But where did this creature come from? How did a being so specific, one eye, enormous, capable of speech and rage, and even, occasionally, of love, embed itself so deeply into the mythology of the ancient world? What ancient fears, what misunderstood bones, what half-glimpsed realities gave birth to the Cyclops? That is the story we are here to tell. Part 1. Before Homer, the oldest giants. The Cyclops did not spring fully formed from the mind of Homer. By the time Homer composed his epic somewhere around the 8th century BCE, the Cyclopes had already lived in the Greek imagination for centuries. They had already done their most important work. They had already forged the lightning. Hesiod and the Forger Gods. Hesiod was a farmer poet from Boeotia who lived around the same time as Homer, and his Theogony, the birth of the gods, is the closest thing ancient Greece had to a book of Genesis. It is here, in this dense and extraordinary poem, that we meet the Cyclopes for the first time in written literature. But the Cyclopes in Hesiod are nothing like the shambling, sailor-devouring monster of Homer's later epic. They are divine. They are Titan's brothers. They are craftsmen of supernatural power. In the Theogony, the Cyclopes are three specific beings: Brontes, thunder; Steropes, lightning; and Arges, brightness. They are sons of Uranos, sky, and Gaia, earth, siblings of the Titans, born with a single eye in the middle of their foreheads. But this single eye in Hesiod is not a deformity. It is simply how they are. Strength and might and craft were in their works. And that last word is crucial. The Cyclopes of Hesiod are not wild creatures. They are makers. When Zeus and the Olympian gods wage their great war against the Titans, the Titanomachy, a conflict that convulses the cosmos for 10 years, it is the Cyclopes who become the gods' secret weapon. Imprisoned by Uranos in the depths of the earth, then freed by Zeus, the Cyclopes repay their liberator by crafting him his most defining gift, the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt, the signature weapon of Zeus, the symbol of divine authority that persists across 2.5 millennia of Western art, was made by the Cyclopes. Each of the 3 brothers contributed his aspect. Brontes, the thunder; Steropes, the lightning; Arges, the brightness that comes before the strike. For Poseidon, they forged the trident. For Hades, the helmet of darkness that makes its wearer invisible. The universe as we know it, with its sea god, death god, and sky god, was shaped, literally, by the labor of one-eyed smiths. This is not the image most people carry when they hear the word Cyclops, but it is the original one. The 2 traditions. There were always 2 separate Cyclops traditions running in parallel through ancient Greek culture, and they never quite resolved into one. The first, the divine smith tradition, is Hesiod's. Primordial forces, craftsmen of the cosmos, beings whose power is measured in creative genius rather than brute strength. After the Titanomachy, their work done, they vanish from mythology. Sometimes they are said to have been killed by Apollo, who slew them in revenge after Zeus struck down his son Asclepius. In death, the smith Cyclopes become the explanation for volcanic activity. The fires and hammering heard within Mount Etna are the sounds of their eternal forge. The second, the savage shepherd tradition, is Homer's. Gigantic, lawless, one-eyed shepherds who live without agriculture, without cities, without the social bonds that Greeks associated with civilization. They represent everything the polis, the city-state, was designed to overcome. Between these 2 traditions lies a vast ocean of questions. Where did either of them come from in the first place? To answer that, we have to leave the library and go outside. We have to look at the bones. Part 2, the bone theory, when paleontology meets myth. The fossil key. In 2000, science historian Adrian Mayer published The First Fossil Hunters, a book whose central argument was as elegant as it was provocative. Many of the monsters and giants of ancient mythology were inspired by the discovery and misinterpretation of fossil remains by ancient peoples who had no framework for understanding what they were looking at. Her argument for the Cyclops focuses on a specific animal, the dwarf elephant, Paleoloxodon falconeri and related species, whose fossilized skulls are found in abundance throughout the Mediterranean basin, particularly on Cyprus, Malta, Sardinia, and Sicily. These animals had evolved in isolation on Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene, island dwarfism shrinking them dramatically over thousands of generations. But their skulls, once exposed by erosion and earthquake, retained one extraordinary feature: a large, circular nasal cavity in the center of the skull's face. To a modern anatomist, this is immediately recognizable as where the trunk attached. But to an ancient Greek farmer or sailor who had never seen a living elephant, it would look like nothing so much as a single, massive eye socket. Imagine picking up such a skull. It is enormous, larger than a human head. Its face confronts you with a single circular opening, deep and shadowed at the very center. The tusk sockets suggest great teeth. The overall impression is of a creature possessed of enormous size and a single, staring eye. You are an ancient Greek, raised on stories of monsters and titans, living in a world where the line between natural and supernatural is a matter of perspective. You look at this skull. You tell someone about it. They tell someone else. The story grows. The skull becomes a creature. The creature becomes a race. And 3,000 years later, a poet sings about a one-eyed giant who keeps sheep on an island and eats sailors. The Mediterranean as a museum of bones. The Pleistocene had populated Europe, Asia, and Africa with animals of extraordinary size. Mammoths, mastodons, cave bears larger than any living today. As the climate changed and these animals died out, their bones were buried. Then the Mediterranean's earthquake-prone, heavily eroded geology began to expose them. Ancient quarrymen breaking into hillsides would find pockets of fossil bone. Farmers plowing fields would turn up enormous teeth. Children exploring coastal caves would find skulls wedged in crevices. These people had no concept of extinction. What they knew was that these bones were enormous, that they came from underground, and that underground was where the primordial beings of mythology, the Titans, the defeated enemies of Zeus, were imprisoned. The logic was almost inevitable. Large bones found underground must belong to large creatures. Large creatures that lived underground must be the monsters of legend. The fossils didn't create the myths from scratch. They confirmed and elaborated myths that were already circulating, gave them physical specificity, and anchored them to particular places. This is why the Cyclops tradition is so strongly associated with Sicily. Sicily, geologically active, rich in fossil deposits, was identified in antiquity as the home of the Cyclops. The ancient historian Thucydides noted that the earliest inhabitants of Sicily were the Cyclops. This is almost certainly a folk memory, not of literal giants, but of the enormous fossil bones the Greeks found when they colonized Sicily in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The skull as face. Human beings are intensely attuned to faces. We see them everywhere, in clouds, in wood grain, in the craters of the moon. This tendency, pareidolia, is not a malfunction, but a feature. A brain oversensitive to the pattern of a face rarely misses a real face in the shadows. A dwarf elephant skull, viewed from the front, is remarkably face-like. There is a broad, circular structure at the top. There are lateral projections that suggest cheekbones. There is a large, central, circular opening where, on a human face, the nose and upper mouth would be. The pattern-seeking human brain processes this immediately as a face. But it is a face with only one eye, because the true eye sockets of the elephant's skull are set far back on the sides, in a position that on a heavily fossilized specimen may not be immediately apparent. What confronts you is that central opening. The Cyclops is born in that moment of misrecognition, and once born, it takes on a life entirely its own.
Part 3. Homer's Monster. The Cave, the Sheep, and the Nobody. The Savage Shepherd. When Odysseus arrives at the island of the Cyclopes in Book 9 of the Odyssey, Homer is careful to establish the setting in terms deeply meaningful to a Greek audience. The Cyclopes have no assemblies for the making of laws, nor any settled customs, but live in hollow caverns in the mountains, each a law to himself. They do not farm, they have no ships, they have no wine of their own making. In the Greek understanding of civilization, they are at the very bottom of the ladder. For the ancient Greeks, the measure of civilization was exactly these things: law, assembly, custom, agriculture, seafaring, wine. A society that lacked them was not a different kind of society. It was a failure of society. And the Cyclopes lack all of them. But Polyphemus himself, the individual Cyclops who becomes Odysseus's adversary, is a more complex figure. He has a name. He prays to Poseidon. He loves his sheep, knows each one by name. He notices the quality of the wine Odysseus gives him, is moved by it, asks for the sailor's name as a gift in exchange. He has the basic emotional equipment of a person. What he lacks is hospitality. In the ancient Greek world, xenia, the sacred obligation between host and guest, was not a social nicety, but a divine law, overseen by Zeus Xenios. Its violation was among the gravest possible offenses. When Odysseus appeals to Polyphemus in the name of Zeus and the duties of hospitality, the Cyclops laughs. The Cyclopes are greater than the gods, he says. We have no need of Zeus. This impiety, this hubris, seals his fate. The name that saves. Trapped in the cave, his men being eaten 2 by 2, Odysseus formulates his plan. He gets Polyphemus drunk on wine of supernatural potency, the gift of a priest of Apollo, far stronger than anything the Cyclops has tasted. When the drunken giant asks Odysseus his name, the hero gives an answer that is also a riddle. Nobody, says Odysseus. In Greek, Outis. It is a name that contains within it the seed of the Cyclops' defeat. When Odysseus and his men blind Polyphemus with a sharpened stake heated in the fire, driving it into the single eye, twisting it until the eyeball hisses, the Cyclops screams for help from his neighbors. But he can only tell them that nobody is hurting me. His neighbors, hearing this, assume he is sick or dreaming. They go back to sleep. The trick has been admired for 3,000 years. But consider what the name means beyond its cleverness. In the cave of the Cyclops, Odysseus really is nobody. He is stripped of his crew, his ships, his city, his title as king of Ithaca. He is alone and powerless against a creature that regards him as a food source. The false name is inseparable from the reality of his vulnerability. The shout across the water. Here is where the story becomes something more than a clever escape. Odysseus and his surviving men row the ships out of reach, safe on the water. And then, against the desperate pleas of his crew, Odysseus cannot help himself. He shouts back to the monster on the shore. He tells him the truth. He tells Polyphemus his real name. Cyclops. If any mortal man ever asks who inflicted upon your eye this shameful blinding, tell him that you were blinded by Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home is in Ithaca. His men beg him to stop. They can see rocks being hurled from the shore, falling closer. But Odysseus cannot stop. The whole point of the escape is that it should be known. This moment has been interpreted as hubris, as heroic pride, as the irrepressible need of the self-made man to claim credit. All of these readings are true, but it is also the claim of personhood against the monster that tried to reduce him to mere meat. "I am not nobody," Odysseus is saying. "I am somebody. I have a name, a father, a home, a history." The Cyclops represents the annihilation of identity, and the shout across the water is Odysseus insisting that he has survived, not just physically, but as a self. And the shout costs him. Polyphemus prays to his father Poseidon to curse the sailor. Poseidon listens. The years of Odysseus's suffering stretch onward. Polyphemus as tragedy. Here is a thought that rarely appears in popular retellings. Polyphemus is, in his own way, a tragic figure. He loves his sheep. He believes in his own gods. He has a father, Poseidon, who will avenge his suffering. And he is blinded, permanently, by a man whose cleverness consists largely in deception. Later Greek poets recognized this tragedy and amplified it. The poet Theocritus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, imagined Polyphemus before Homer's story, before the sailors came, before the blinding. In Theocritus's telling, Polyphemus is young and in love. The object of his affection is Galatea, a sea nymph. His love is genuine, sincere, and completely unrequited. He sits on the shore and sings to her. He combs his tangled hair with a pine comb. He promises her gifts, bear cubs, deer fawns, the freshest milk from his sheep. "O white Galatea," he sings, "why do you reject the one who loves you? You are more white than curd to look on, softer than a lamb, more lively than a calf, more bright than unripe grapes." He is ludicrous and touching and achingly human in his longing. And when we read Theocritus after Homer, the blinding takes on an extra layer of sorrow. This is the eye that wept for Galatea, the eye that watched for her form in the waves. Odysseus put it out. The Roman poet Ovid takes the story further in his Metamorphoses. In Ovid's version, Galatea is in love with someone else. His name is Acis, and he is everything Polyphemus is not: young, beautiful, gentle, human-scaled. Polyphemus finds them together on a beach. His love song stops suddenly in the middle of a line. That silence is more frightening than any rage. He picks up a piece of the mountain and hurls it at the boy. Acis is crushed, but from beneath the stone, blood flows. And then the blood becomes clear water, and the water becomes a stream, and the stream becomes a river. And Acis emerges transformed, made divine, preserved forever as water rather than flesh. He flows, he remains. And Polyphemus remains on his clifftop, unchanged, unloved. His love transformed to violence. His grief turned to stone. He loves too much. He wants too much. He cannot channel enormous emotion through the narrow passages of civilized behavior. And so the thing he wanted most becomes the thing he destroys. Every great story we tell contains this person. The Cyclops was merely the first. Part 4. The Cyclops in the Ancient World. Virgil's Shore of Monsters. 4 centuries after Homer, Virgil composed the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy, and the Cyclops episode he could not omit. His handling is distinctly Roman in character. Aeneas's fleet arrives on Sicily at night. In the morning, a wild and desperate figure emerges from the forest. A Greek soldier named Achaemenides, one of Odysseus's men left behind when the ships escaped. He begs the Trojans for rescue, anything to be away from this island. As he finishes his story, Polyphemus himself appears on the shore, enormous, blinded, using a pine tree as a staff, feeling his way down to the sea to wash his empty eye socket. The Cyclops wades into the water. The ships row frantically away. Then, hearing the sound of oars, Polyphemus lets out a howl of rage so enormous it echoes from the mountains and raises waves in the sea. And from every mountaintop, the other Cyclopes come running, a forest of enormous one-eyed figures assembling on the shore, straining to see the ships that have escaped them. They stand, Virgil says, like oak trees or cypress trees on a mountainside, vast, upright, reaching, impossible. It is one of antiquity's great images. The monsters on the shore, unable to reach the ships, reduced to watching. The travelers watching back from what they hope is a safe distance. The sound of Polyphemus's howling still filling the air. Virgil makes a subtle but important change to the tradition. Aeneas does not blind Polyphemus. He simply escapes him. Where Odysseus engages, Aeneas retreats. Where the Greek hero insists on his name, the Roman hero is patient. The Roman virtue is pietas, faithful devotion to duty, family, and the gods. And pietas does not require you to shout your name across the water to the monster you've just outrun. The philosophical monster. The playwright Euripides wrote the only surviving Greek satyr play based on the Polyphemus story. His Cyclops is a bawdy comic piece, but it contains a remarkable speech. When Odysseus appeals to Polyphemus in the name of hospitality and the laws of Zeus, the Cyclops responds with what is essentially a proto-nihilist manifesto. The gods are nothing to him. He is his own god. Wealth and the pleasure of the belly are the only real deities. My belly is the greatest Zeus there is. The line is funny. It is a satyr play, but it is also a serious articulation of a position the Greeks took seriously enough to mock carefully. That pleasure is the highest good, that social obligations are merely conventional, that the individual's comfort supersedes the demands of community. The Cyclops, in Euripides' handling, is not simply a brute. He is a brute with a philosophy, and we recognize the philosophy. Its echoes show up in every age.
Part 5. The world the Cyclops made. Walls beyond human power. There is a peculiar tradition in ancient Greek archaeology connecting the Cyclopes to something entirely physical and real. The massive stone walls at Bronze Age sites throughout Greece. Built from enormous, roughly shaped blocks fitted together without mortar, these walls are called Cyclopean masonry, and the name is telling. The classical Greeks, already centuries removed from the civilization that built these structures, concluded that only the one-eyed giants, with their divine strength and tradition of working in stone and metal, could have moved stones of such size. The walls at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Medea looked impossible. We know now that these walls were built by Mycenaean Greeks, the Bronze Age civilization that flourished from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. Moving large stones is primarily a problem of logistics, coordinating many workers, designing efficient systems of leverage, rather than of individual strength.
But the civilization that built those walls collapsed in the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE, wiping out palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean and plunging Greece into a cultural dark age. When Greece emerged centuries later, the knowledge of how the walls were built was lost. What remained were the walls themselves, and so they became the work of Cyclopes. The irony is exquisite. The one-eyed giants of mythology, who in Homer cannot even build a ship, are credited in folk memory with some of the greatest feats of ancient engineering. The two traditions, savage shepherd and divine smith, bleed into each other here, and the attribution honors builder and monster simultaneously. The term Cyclopean masonry survives in modern archaeology as a technical term for this style of construction, wherever in the world it appears. The Cyclops as colonial allegory. Modern scholars have noted that the Cyclops episode functions as a colonial allegory, a narrative of civilized Greeks encountering primitive others. When Odysseus arrives at the island, he behaves like a colonial explorer, asserting the right to be there, helping himself to stores in Polyphemus's cave, appealing not to the Cyclops' own customs, but to the Greek god Zeus. He observes, with acquisitive longing, that the uninhabited island nearby would make excellent farmland. The Cyclopes have resources, fertile land, abundant sheep, caves, but lack the capacity to exploit them as a civilized Greek would. This characterization was not ideologically neutral. The Odyssey was composed precisely when Greek city-states were establishing colonies throughout the Mediterranean, including in Sicily. The myth of the primitive cave-dwelling Cyclops, who doesn't know how to use his land, is convenient for a civilization showing up on someone else's shores. The myth does not stand outside history. It is made of history.
Part 6. From Rome to the Renaissance and beyond. The Renaissance and the lovesick giant. The Renaissance brought the Cyclops back into full cultural view. As Greek texts became more widely available, especially after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which sent Greek scholars and their manuscripts fleeing west, Homer was read again, and the Cyclops episode was recognized for what it is, one of the great narrative set pieces of Western literature. Renaissance artists were immediately drawn to the visual possibilities. Polyphemus appears in numerous works of the period, usually paired with the story of Galatea. The contrast is compositionally perfect. The ugly monster on the cliff, the beautiful nymph in the sea. The Flemish painter Annibale Carracci painted a magnificent fresco of Polyphemus hurling the rock at the lovers, his enormous body dominating the clifftop, his single eye wide with the madness of jealousy. The monster's anguish is palpable even through the violence of his action. The Renaissance pastoral tradition returned obsessively to the Theocritus Ovid version, the lovesick giant and the indifferent nymph, finding in it the perfect pastoral note: beauty, loss, the impossibility of desire in an idealized landscape. Polyphemus had traveled from Homer's cannibal to a figure of genuine romantic pathos, and Western art found both versions compelling for entirely different reasons. Part 7. The Modern Cyclops. The monster in modern literature. James Joyce, in Ulysses, his modernist retelling of the Odyssey set in a single day in Dublin,
renders the Cyclops episode as a chapter narrated by a belligerent, anti-Semitic Irishman in a pub who cannot see beyond his own narrow prejudice. Joyce's Cyclops is a specific kind of modern monster, the nationalist, the bigot, the man who has only one way of seeing the world. His interlocutor, Leopold Bloom, the novel's Jewish everyman and Odysseus figure, escapes by being nobody in a social sense, a man without a fixed national or religious identity in a world that demands them. The identification of the Cyclops' single eye with ideological narrowness, the refusal to see more than one thing at once, has been one of the most productive uses of the myth in modern culture. The monster's eye becomes a symbol not of physical deformity, but of a particular human failure, the failure of perspective, the inability to hold more than one truth simultaneously. In popular culture, the transformation goes further. From Mike Wazowski in Pixar's Monsters, Inc. to the Cyclops in Futurama, the one-eyed giant has been domesticated into gentle absurdity, the grumpy monster who just wants to be understood. This is, in its way, as significant a transformation as any the myth has undergone. The terror of the uncivilized has become the character you feel a little sorry for. The monster has become the misfit. Science catches up. Since Adrian Mayer's work, the paleontological argument has gained significant academic traction. Excavations in Sicilian cave systems have found dwarf elephant remains in locations corresponding remarkably well with the legendary geography of the Cyclops tradition. Along the eastern coast, near Mount Etna, where Polyphemus was supposed to dwell. The hypothesis also explains one peculiar detail: the Cyclopes' specific association with Sicily. If the tradition were purely literary, it could have been set anywhere. But the Cyclopes keep returning to Sicily and the western Mediterranean islands, to the precise geography of dwarf elephant fossil deposits. The geography of the myth tracks the geography of the bones. A dwarf elephant skull from the Pleistocene, cleaned and displayed, is both utterly alien and deeply compelling. The nasal cavity stares at you from the center of the face. The scale is wrong. Too big for what you know, too small for what the myth describes. And yet you can see exactly how an ancient Greek, finding this in a cave, might have looked at it with wonder and the irresistible human need to make a story. The bone becomes an eye. The eye stares back. The story begins. Part 8. The Eye as Symbol. What the Cyclops means. Throughout the entire history of the Cyclops tradition, from Hesiod's divine smiths to Homer's cave-dwelling shepherd, to Theocritus's lovesick farmer, to Ovid's jealous murderer, to Joyce's bigoted Dubliner, one symbolic thread persists: the eye. The single eye is not merely a physical trait. It is the defining characteristic, the thing that makes a Cyclops, rather than simply a very large person. And it carries symbolic weight that two-eyedness does not. Because we have two eyes, we have depth perception. We can judge distance. We can perceive the world as it actually is, with volume and space and dimension. The single eye cannot do this. It sees flatly. This physical fact maps onto a moral reality with disturbing precision. The Cyclops, in almost every version of the story, cannot perceive other people as three-dimensional beings, as people with interiority, with reality separate from their usefulness or dangerousness to him. Polyphemus looks at Odysseus and sees food. His single eye is not equipped for the kind of seeing that civilized life requires. The seeing that recognizes others as equal to oneself, that allows for empathy, for law, for the reciprocal hospitality of Xenia. When Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, he literalizes the monster's already existing spiritual blindness. The Cyclops, who could not see people as people, now cannot see at all. The punishment fits the crime, and it fits because it is symbolic. Homer understood that the eye means something, that the difference between seeing with one eye and seeing with two is the difference between a being who perceives the world as flat and a person who perceives it as full. The Cyclops story begins with absolute, unchallengeable power. He is enormous in his own home, the cave sealed with a boulder no human force can move. It ends with him blinded, stumbling on the shore, throwing rocks at the sound of water, cursing a nobody who has already escaped. The single eye, which saw food where there was a person, has been taken from him. And the person, the somebody who pretended to be nobody, has sailed away. The monster as mirror. Every culture's monsters are a mirror of its deepest fears and values. The Cyclops fears nothing, and that is what makes him monstrous to a civilization built on mutual obligation. Fear of Zeus's punishment for violating hospitality, fear of neighbors' judgment, fear of the social consequences of behaving as an animal. The Cyclops, beyond all such fears, is a creature without civilization's tethers. We live in a world that still produces cyclopes, not literal one-eyed giants, but the figurative equivalents. The figure who places himself beyond the laws that govern others, who consumes without reciprocating, who sees other people as resources rather than as equals. The Cyclops who declares, "My belly is the greatest Zeus there is," replacing divine law with the law of appetite, is a recognizable figure in every age, including our own. What the story tells us, what it has always told us, is that cleverness, not violence, not superior force, not divine intervention, is the tool by which such figures are overcome. Odysseus does not defeat Polyphemus by being stronger. He defeats him by being smarter, by thinking several moves ahead, by understanding that names matter and don't matter simultaneously, by exploiting the very confidence that makes the Cyclops dangerous. The lesson is not comfortable. Odysseus is not admirable in every way. He lies. He uses people. He sacrifices his men through bad judgment and uncontrollable pride. His triumph over Polyphemus is genuine, but it is also the beginning of his punishment, because he cannot resist announcing who he is. The victory of intelligence over brute force is real, but it comes at a cost. It always does.
Epilogue. The eye that still watches. We began in a cave on an island in the ancient Mediterranean, or perhaps in the imagination of a Greek sailor, or perhaps in the mind of a poet who had never seen the sea but knew everything about it from the mouths of those who had. We began with the sound of footsteps that shook the earth, and the light that went dark, and the single terrible eye. We have traveled far from that cave. We have visited the forge where the thunderbolt was made, and the court of the blind poet who sang the old stories into permanent form. We have watched a lovesick monster comb his hair for a nymph who would never love him. We have examined fossil skulls with a nasal cavity where an eye socket should be, and traced the way that misidentified bone becomes story, becomes literature, becomes civilization. The Cyclops is old,
older than writing, old enough to have gathered to itself the strata of a dozen different traditions. The divine smith and the savage shepherd, the folk memory and the philosophical allegory, the colonial narrative and the love story and the tragedy. Each layer deposited on the last, like the sediment of the Mediterranean seafloor, building up into something rich and strange and dense with meaning. And the myth is not finished. It will never be finished. New Cyclopes emerge in new cultural moments. The surveillance camera that watches without reciprocity. The algorithm that sees you as data rather than as a person. The fear of being seen without being truly seen. Of having one's complexity reduced to a flat image in someone else's single eye, is as contemporary as it is ancient. Somewhere under the Mediterranean, a dwarf elephant skull is slowly covered with sediment. Its central nasal cavity, that great circular opening that so disturbed and fascinated our ancestors, fills with fine marine silt. In a few thousand years, if the sea recedes again, if the limestone shifts, if the earthquake breaks open the hillside in just the right way, some descendant of ours may find it, and they may look at that central opening, that single vast eye-shaped void, and feel, before they can stop themselves, before reason can intervene, feel that something is looking back. That is where the Cyclops lives, not in the cave, not in the skull, in the moment before we understand what we are seeing, in the place where a hole in a fossil becomes a gaze, where a pattern in the dark becomes a face, where the ancient human terror of being watched by something that cannot be reasoned with, something that sees you not as a person but as a meal, rises up from somewhere very close to the center of us and looks out at the world. The world looks back. The story begins again.
Thank you for staying with us. A new video is released every week. Subscribe to the Historical Facts channel so you don't miss it, where you'll find plenty more fascinating stories about our world. All the best, and see you next time.